All right, guys, it's time again to put your fingers onto the keyboard and practice what you have learned in the last lesson. In this lesson, I've gone ahead and extracted the part of the app, which is this input and this button, into a separate component called input area. And as you can see, all it has is just the input and the button. And I've kept all of the code from your previous edition of the to-do list app, but I've not been very helpful in changing anything else. All that the starting code has is an extracted input area, and I've inserted that component back in where it used to be. But you'll notice that there's loads and loads of errors, and the code to start off will be very unhappy with you, and your job is to make the compiler happy. Or more specifically, the idea is to make the app work as it did before. So being able to add new components, but in this case, of course, this entire section is now a separate component. So you'll have to think about how you're going to manage this component tree. Because we've now got a app component which renders a input area and lots of to-do item components. So have a think about what you learned in the last lesson and see if you can complete this challenge and make the errors go away and make the app work as it did before. Pause the video now and try to give that a go. And then once you're done, come back and walk through the solution with you. All right, so the first thing we need to address is inside our input area, we've got an on change, which detects when the input actually updates. So this is something that probably should be managed inside this component. We could keep that local because nobody else really cares until the moment when the button gets clicked, and then we'd probably want to pass whatever is in the input to this items array. So firstly, I'm going to move this handle change function into the input area to save myself and maybe yourself some work. Now what it's doing is it's going to handle the change when this input updates, and it's going to get hold of the new value from the event target, which is this input. Next, it calls set input text with that new value. So we can go ahead and port this part over as well. So now this input area is going to keep track of the state of the input text, which it holds, and we are able to set it using this function. Now, if you have done what I've just done and you get errors, then if you hover over it, you'll see that it says use state is not defined. Remember that when we manually type out use state, Code Sandbox is helpful enough to automatically insert the import for us, but if we just copy it over, then we don't get that benefit. So let's make that error disappear by importing useState. Now, this part of the code is now pretty happy, and the only thing that is still screaming at us is this button. Because when it gets clicked, we want to be able to add the item, so the current value of input text, into this items array. But add item is a function that lives in our app component, and it doesn't actually make sense to move it to our input area because this items array actually needs to be accessed by a lot of components in our tree, including our to-do items and our input area. So it makes sense to keep it at the top level in our app component. All we need to do is some sort of way of calling this add item function and having some sort of way of being able to pass over the input text that it could add to all of the previous items in our items array. So how can we trigger this function from within this child component? Well, it's going to be a case of using props, of course, to pass over this add item function. So when we call input area and we render it, we're going to pass over the prop, which you can call anything you want, but I'm going to call on add. And I'm going to pass over this add item function as the value of this prop. So now inside my input area, I can now pick up on the props, which is going to be props.onAdd. And a good idea if you get confused by all of these props that's happening, is to actually go into the components, check the input area, and see the props here. And you can see that we can access the add item function through the onAdd property. So props.onAdd. So now when this button gets clicked, it's going to call whatever is stored inside this onAdd prop. And that is, of course, the add item function that lives inside our app.jsx right here. And then we're going to want to pass over some input text to put into our array of items. So how do we do that? Well, we can achieve that by, instead of just calling this add function, actually passing in a function. And inside this function, we can again tap into props.onAdd and then pass in the value of the current input text, like so. Now what will happen is when the button gets clicked, it's going to trigger this function, and when it does, it's going to call the onAdd function, which remember is tied to the add item. It's going to call onAdd and pass in the input text that lives inside this component. And that input text is, of course, whatever the user has currently typed into the input. Now we're able to catch whatever is passed over inside here and add it into our items array as we did before. Now, the final thing that we wanted to do was to be able to reset the input text. So this is no longer the place we're going to do it. Instead, we're going to call it inside our onClick, which gets triggered when the button gets pressed. So inside here, after we've called the onAdd passing over the input text, we can now call set input text and set it back to an empty string because we're already done with it and we've already passed it over. Now let's go ahead and refresh our app and test it out. So let's try and typing buy milk into our input area, and notice how the state has now updated. So this is the state of that input text, which hopefully when we click add is going to call add item and pass it over to our app component. So now we've got an app component, an input area, and our first to-do item. So this is our very basic component tree. And we were able to use these callbacks to pass something that has state in the input area back up to the app component, and that data then gets populated down to the to-do item. So did you manage to complete this challenge? Again, if it's confusing at all, then be sure to just repeat it a couple of times until it gets familiar and until it makes sense. But in the next lesson, we're going to be finally ready to put together all of these things that we've learned and build out the third iteration of our Keeper app. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.